The term Latino is reductionist. It surreptitiously keeps imperialist, racist, expansionist components in itself. Therefore, I think it is necessary to establish a new name to reaffirm its own identity, different and not Eurocentric. In studying the history of American expansionism, Albert Weinberg notes that Manifest Destiny is a once-honored expansionist slogan, expressing a dogma of supreme self-confidence and ambition. The idea that the incorporation into the United States of all the adjacent regions constituted the virtually inevitable fulfillment of a moral mission, assigned to the nation by Providence itself. Weinberg, N.D., p. 16. National morality is not synonymous with individual morality, however, that does not annul its existence. There is a national morality. As for individual morality, it subordinates self-interest to the beginning, obtaining a certain degree of self-sacrifice. However, at the level of international morality, the opposite happens. It is not self-sacrifice, but self-aggrandizement, demanding that the other party contract, where selfishness is the result of altruism. Weinberg, N.D., p. 19. Moral ideology, and self-interest, have been the components of expansionism. The ancient concept of natural law gained strength in theology. In the 18th century, natural law, prior to manifest destiny, gave rise to nationalism. It is assumed that there is a natural law that is eternal, mandatory, and imposed by God, and therefore, governments that act against this natural right, may appeal to the right of revolution. Just as there is an individual unconscious, there is a historical unconscious, which manifests itself in time and space through what I have called historical transmutations. A historical material happens from generation to generation, taking other forms as that time passes, and gradually losing the previous constitution, without completely dissolving through the haze of time, but becoming distorted into other components, and continuing a process of constant transmutation. The U.S. imperialist and expansionist components, and in a broad sense that of the nations shaped by Protestantism which we have carefully analyzed, are the result of an extensive historical process of constant transmutations that received a strong impulse at the time of the Protestant Reformation. According to Weinberg, the first doctrine to reflect the nationalist theology of manifest destiny was the idea of a divine decree of independence. Then followed the doctrine of a national mission which influenced later American nationalism. Weinberg, N.D., p. 28. Americans were supposed to universally represent the first people God favored, or predestined to choose their forms of government. They were the champions of the rights of all men. The cause of the United States should be the cause of all humanity. It had a place of honor for the fight, for the dignity and happiness of human nature and for extending freedom and democracy to the wild and ignorant nations. Although the right of conquest was excluded, according to the idea that we mentioned, that of a national mission, this compulsive impulse was denied, projected to the European nations, and reaffirming that the true American sentiment was that of the good neighbor. That only sought the freedom of the peoples, and their concern and consecration to the cause of humanity, thus complying with the law imposed by Providence. The true feeling of territorial aggrandizement and colonialism was rationalized under political discourses that are supposed to be necessary to justify the essential benefit of freedom, happiness, democracy, and the security of the empire. This security must be assumed superior to the legal rights of other nations, in such a way that the security of the empire must be paid for with the insecurity of other nations. The rights of other nations were inalienable as long as they did not oppose the more inalienable imperial rights, as expressed by Weinberg, that the right that he conquered was superior to the right that he violated. Weinberg, N.D., p. 48. The empire had to carry out an evident destiny, a providential mission on behalf of the peoples of humanity. This thought is motivated by unconscious messianic forces. It has derived from the transmutation of the Christian atonement where the Messiah dies to liberate humanity. This legendary theological induction enters the field of imperialist political philosophy, replacing the Christian Messiah with an imperialist messianism, savior and redeemer of humanity. Now it is the empire that must be sacrificed so that humanity is free and obtains the light of the salvation of freedom and democracy. The concept of nature, the design of nature, The natural right, the law of nature, rights based on nature, used from a political point of view, comes to replace the Christian concept of divine nature. I think I perceive in this terminological relationship, the process of transmutations that extends from Darwinian ideas of natural law and the survival of the fittest to the natural sciences towards political philosophy and Spencerian sociology. But components have also been transmuted that, because they are historically older, lie more hidden, in the historical unconscious. We refer here to the Calvinist influence of predestination, as forces prior to these processes. We can speak then of a Calvinist predestination of the fittest, thus relating the process of transmutations from Calvinist theology through Darwinian biology to our days, emerging in political philosophy, as one of the last processes of this long journey of transmutations. For the generally Protestant Christianity, all people who have not had the possibility of knowing the only truth, despite that, must be considered pagans or Gentiles, apart from divine law. He has reached the cruel conviction when considering that whoever does not know the divine law, that is to say, who never had the possibility of contact with faith, will have eternal torture as their final destination. Based on this belief, it is very difficult for Monotheocentrism to anthropologically value the great civilizations such as China, India, Egypt, among many others, because their religious beliefs are considered culturally opposed to the only truth. We have already seen that Greece is an exception. Greek has been the representative language of the New Testament Christian scriptures, establishing a relationship between Greek culture and Christianity. Hegel stated that talking about Greek culture is like being at home. The house is synonymous with security, protection, while monotheistic and racist Hegelian ideas did not allow him to value the national concept of what is different. Everything that is unfamiliar to us inspires fear, distrust, rejection. It is more difficult to identify with what is different. Under the doctrine of interest, the U.S. claimed, and still continues to do so, American rights to prevent European interference in the Western Hemisphere, and thus combat any form of political expression that threatens the United States. Interests of the Empire. It is the Monroe Doctrine, based on a geographical political ideological principle, by which it must be assumed that the distance that separates America from Europe naturally justifies the independence, isolation, and control of the hemisphere by the Empire. But this geographical reasoning is a double-edged sword. It prohibits not only the territorial expansion of Europe in another hemisphere, but also the expansion of the United States outside the continental limits. Weinberg, N.D., p. 71. Hatred towards the original nations, the desire to plunder their territories by force, led the empire to use multiple stratagems to achieve its objectives. Declare Indian laws void. Make the existence of an organized Indian society impossible. Go to the religious argument of moral justification. It must be assumed that the Americans are the only ones who are determined by God to decide the fate of the usurped lands, and even the lives of their former inhabitants. The original nations were considered by the European as erratic nations, therefore their lands had to be expropriated. Citing Governor Harrison of Indiana, Weinberg quotes this rhetorical question. Is one of the best portions of the globe to remain in a state of nature, the domain of a few miserable savages, when it seems destined by the Creator to sustain a large population and to be the seat of civilization, science, and humanity? True religion? Weinberg, N.D., p. 85. The word savage has an anthropological connotation, and here substitutes the theological term pagan. From pagan to savage there is a process of transmutation and deformation that extends in time from theology to the natural sciences and political philosophy. In Senator Benton's view, the white race had a greater right to the land because it used it in accordance with the Creator's intentions. Weinberg, N.D., p. 80. Therefore the inferior race that occupied those lands, had to hand them over to the white, Protestant, and predestined race. It is very important to know the ideas, and the affects of the subject, what he really considers in relation to the concept of weakness in itself. Know what you really think, and what you feel about the concept of poverty. What is your position in the face of oppressive social and political systems, in the face of the weak and the weak, in the face of need and the needy, in the face of illness and the sick, in the face of nature, ecology, and the environment, in the face of oppression towards the women, contempt for the different, for the undocumented, for the plundered original nations, for those who demand justice, for those who work hard to achieve economic, political, social, sexual, and defenseless changes. Any demonstration facing injustices committed against the civilian population through dictatorships, oppressive and authoritarian powers is rationalized by downplaying it, or blaming the civilian population for having instigated the oppressive power for improper behavior of contempt and violence. Those who share their glory with the oppressor and the aggressor, will interpret any act against the established power as an act of threat against themselves, because they share the glory with that same power, which provides them with an unconscious feeling of significance, protection, and security. These same oppressive powers, be they political, military, social, express exactly the hatred that these subjects to whom we refer, feel for the weakness and impotence in themselves. Therefore, a link is established between the subject and the aggressor, under a projective identification. Hatred is not only directed towards certain people, in the first place it is directed towards certain conditions of helplessness, impotence, frustration, before which there is a fear of falling. Hating certain conditions leads to hating the subjects who represent them. Those who brandish the banner of freedom but who in fact oppose movements for sexual diversity, claims for the disappeared in military dictatorships, gender policies, civil disobedience, and any protest manifestation and disagreements, they do so because they oppose a common denominator that includes all these same facts: contempt and unconscious fear of the condition of helplessness and weakness in itself. Certain ideologies, religious institutions, and political parties remain rooted from the unconscious aspects, to the influence of colonization. The more conservative a political party is, the more it will be rooted in colonial influences, and to the extent that said party detaches itself from these irrational forces, it will become aware of the value of human weakness, powerlessness, and defenselessness. It will gradually accept the value of the autochthonous. It will reject the economic and military oppression of the populations, it will understand the pain of the dispossessed, of the emigrants, the needy, and it will take care of them. It will stop interpreting reality under the influence of inferiors and superiors, valuing heterogeneity. However, any process can have a setback in its forms. Just as a political party can move away from colonial influence, it can go back and forth towards it. It can relapse to the extent that this decolonization process is interrupted. Therefore, it is essential to constantly decolonize politics. The so-called reformist political parties are those that have been established by separating from the conservative political parties. By letting go of the conservative parties, they have been shedding and without being fully aware of it from tradition. Colonialist historical forces are intrinsically related to tradition and to conservative aspects through an intense attachment to genealogical imitation, to the irrational perpetuity of ideas and beliefs. Therefore, the ideology of the conservative political parties contains a greater influx of colonial residue. These parties resist structural changes because they fear losing identity and hegemony. It is impossible to achieve change if we are not willing to lose. However, as nations gradually decolonize, they will oppose the logic of these conservative parties which, sooner or later, will lose political power and will have to make a decision for a change. While the reformist political parties have taken the initiative in separating from the conservative political parties, this does not imply that they have completely freed themselves from these historical forces. Political decolonization demands a continuous process of change, and for this it is necessary to know the mechanism of these historical forces that intervene in us. In reality, conservative political parties are influenced to a greater extent by these colonialist forces than reformist political parties. To illustrate the example of the rupture of political forces between reformist and conservative parties, let us take as an analogy the period of the Reformation and the theological separation between Catholics and Protestants. From the beginning the so-called Protestants were part of Catholicism, subsequently departing from it. This Protestant separation brought with it a greater departure from medieval religious customs, which continued to exist with greater intensity in the Catholic religion, bearer of such traditions and resistant to new changes. This separation created a certain freedom in the new religion, and produced a break in religious traditions. In the same way, we must evaluate political parties according to the influence they have against these historical forces. One political party will be more conservative than another, if it remains under the influence of these colonial forces, resisting changes. The term "finger of God," frequently used by American expansionists, has theological connotations. It appears in the book of Exodus to point out the divine curse on the country of Egypt and to free Israel from the oppression of Pharaoh. We see here the close relationship between Hebrew Christian monotheisms and American expansionism. That righteous, liberating, mysterious, accusing finger of God was superior to that of the Egyptian pagan magicians, who could not prevent divine punishments. It must be assumed then, that finger of God freed the Israelites from the hands of Pharaoh, and sent them to the Promised Land. Therefore, in the same way, the American Empire as a spiritual substitute, must reproduce the same facts that God bestowed upon the Israelites. It is assumed that U.S. imperialism, after having crossed the Atlantic Ocean, believed to have reached a Promised Land, escaping from a Pharaoh, represented by English oppression, and once they reached the New World, and in the same way that did the Israelites, they were impelled to expel and eliminate the old pagan inhabitants that already populated these lands. Weinberg affirms that in the last years of the 19th century some expansionists began to speak semi-humorously of the manifest destiny of the English race and the Yankee nation that is to inherit the earth. Weinberg, N.D., p. 75. In the same way, the monotheistic term of inheriting the land appears linked to the concept of an imperialist political inheritance that must also be inherited. Therefore, the empire must inherit the earth from a political plane, because the providential will has predestined it that way since before the foundation of this world. Consequently, the religious expansionist inheritance becomes a political expansionist inheritance. In this way we visualize certain religious characters in U.S. expansionist policy. A religion whose God is shown and at the same time is hidden, whose object of devotion has gone from being the Christian God to become the God of nation, the God of duty, the God of destiny, whose martyrs are represented by the thousands of soldiers who have fallen, killed on the battlefield, turned into national heroes. A religion that must be preached to all humanity through the use of weapons, deception, betrayal, lies, hatred, interference, plunder, oppression, justifications of a moral character, and achieve at the same time everything this is rationalized under the pursuit of justice, democracy, protection, and even with the aim of caring for nations that cannot govern themselves. I must distinguish between monotheism and monotheism. When I speak of monotheism I mean the three religious typologies, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. On the other hand, when I speak of monotheocentrism, I do so to refer to the unconscious forces that operate as a common denominator between these three different typologies. Monotheocentrism in the broad sense is unitary, unicentric, it exalts the one over the diverse, and it is also bifragmentary. It imposes itself as a single truth, and at the same time fragments reality into two opposing sections that constantly litigate each other. Note that throughout my work, I have referred to the term monotheism instead of speaking of religion, although I have used the two terms interchangeably. The term monotheocentrism I have used as a common denominator of the three Western monotheocentrism religions. Regardless of the Western monotheistic religion in question, monotheocentrism contains in itself strong common expansionist tendencies. Monotheisms have been influenced by Hebrew colonialism, by the chosen people, being supported through divine intervention with the ultimate goal of annihilating all the ancient pagan dwellers on the other side of the Red Sea and taking their lands, annihilating children, women, and the elderly, demolishing idols. This monotheism has been, and continues to be, a very important factor in the fragmentation of Western thought, regarding the mechanistic, fractional, predestined gaze, transmuted from religion into the taxonomy of scientific knowledge, literature, art, political philosophy, and thinking in general. I have mentioned the monotheocentric forces, to point out a certain common religious psychological structure that derives from Hebrew monotheism. We can speak of a Protestant monotheism, of a Catholic or Islamic monotheism, to point out that beyond their theological differences, these religions contain in common certain contents of the Hebrew monotheism from which they have derived. That is to say, although religions are different from each other, Monotheocentrism seeks to find the common denominator between them. We have seen that Christianity contains in itself expansive forces that gradually drifted through rationalized political manifestations, in such a way that this religious impulse was transformed into a colonialist and imperialist impulse. We can speak of three expansionisms within Christian monotheism. 1. Commissioned expansionism. Based on the Great Commission to go all over the world and preach the gospel. 2. Anthropological expansionism. It consists of forcing to change the social, moral, aesthetic, and cultural customs of all the idolatrous peoples of the earth, for the customs that derive from the true religion. During the Spanish occupation of the continent, every effort was made to extirpate idolatry. To achieve this, it was necessary to impose Christian education on children, founding schools for the children of chiefs, as the only remedy for assimilation, to ensure that subsequent generations would lose their religious identity and impose Christianity and Spanish cultural logic on them. Colonialist education must deconstruct identities to build its own on the conquered nations. This same education continues its existence in our days, in our classrooms, and in our study texts, preserving Eurocentric colonial content, through the teaching of historical myths, praise for the conquerors, under a Eurocentric and American paradigm. Punishment was applied to the indigenous, when the path through education had no effect on their decisions. Solemn cars were held by means of which all the towns of a certain province were summoned, forcing them to bring the idols, the huacas, and the damned relics to be publicly burned in the presence of viceroys and religious authorities. Of the same monotheism has historically instigated to burn and destroy what does not belong to that only truth, making a pyre with the books of magic according to the account of the Book of Acts. First they were forced to destroy idols, to lose their own cultural and religious identity, then they were instigated through Christian education, and later they were subjected to the confession of their idolatrous sins. The objective consisted of extirpating idolatry, uprooting the deep-rooted and ancient roots, ensuring that the Indians visited are taught, disillusioned, and chastened so that the children are better than their parents and the grandchildren better than parents and grandparents. Create positions of spiritual police in the hands of the visitors of idolatry, in charge of going through the towns fighting this evil. The visitors were men experienced in the things of the Indians. They knew their language well, talented and effective in the pulpit, learned men and theologians who knew how to teach such ignorant people the mysteries of our holy faith, as well as undo and refute errors, unmasking that damage that was so underhanded and covered, to disabuse to the deceived, and to teach, using mercy with all, proceeding with some rigor of justice against the stubborn and rebellious. The extirpation of idolatry carried out by Spanish Catholicism on the Indians was the same combat that Protestantism carried out on the Catholic churches in Europe during the Reformation period, invading churches, destroying statues, images, and crucifixes. Forbidding to celebrate any Catholic office, punishing with prison or exile all those who violate these provisions. The extirpation of idolatry represents the fundamental monotheocentric characteristic in the colonization process and in the imposition of monotheistic religions. Arriaga, 1621, ch. 8. Mama Pasha or Pachamama, as the natives called Mother Earth, have a feminine connotation, and were revered mainly by women. The cultural shock is given by the collision of an authoritarian father, the man imposing on the woman, the patriarchal system over the matriarchal, the individual over the collective. We must always bear in mind that monotheocentrism has marked patriarchal features, although it contains matriarchal elements in some of its religious texts. There is an unconscious concept of the existence of a sexed and male God. Even his three divine dimensions of the Trinity considered by Christianity, are three times masculine, a Father, a Son, and a Holy Spirit. 3. The symbolic expansionism of Canaan. We have already said that Christianity in the broad sense considers itself as spiritual Israel, and as such, it must reach a promised land that Christianity itself must build. As there is no geographically located Christian promised land in this world, except in heaven, only through transmutation from religious content into political content, it is possible to temporarily substitute the heavenly promised land for an earthly promised land. Each Christian and colonizing people, by taking for themselves large tracts of territories, and oppressing their former inhabitants, in the same way as Israel justified their actions by means of this theological argument extracted from the Pentateuch. In this way, imperialism has justified its expansionism by believing that it had conquered, through divine providence, its own promised land by crossing the Atlantic Ocean as if it were the Red Sea. Beyond expressing faith and love in one God, monotheism expresses no faith in other gods. The monotheistic expansionist impulse is not based specifically on love for that one, but rather, on fighting the idolatry of many others. It is not focused on what it is, but on what it is not. He must fight what he is not in order to be. It does not expand from what it is, but from what it is not, fighting differences. Monotheocentrism cannot respect differences, unless the concept of single truth is psychologically dissipated to become one more truth, a perspective shared with other exponents. However, the dissipation of absolute truth is a head-on collision with your own absolutist theology. In the course of this 21st century, it is important that nations consider as a joint task to erode the remains of these colonial forces that have participated from an unconscious dimension. May each nation have the freedom to choose its destiny and its forms of government, therefore, walking in this process of evolution through a path of peace, tolerance, solidarity, and love. The right of minorities, the search for freedom and the expansion of the human being that, having gone through a historical stage of emergence in the 60s of the 20th century, can continue in this 21st century, its expansive process of change. In the West, conservative religions and neoliberal political trends historically shaped and cradled by religion have been seriously threatened by the depth and speed of social change. Religious changes must also have intense repercussions on political, social, economic, and scientific life. These conservative groups threatened by changes, and by a new way of seeing reality, interpreting it and living it, have reacted with great anger, through the hegemonic media. The libertarian populations, which fought for a change in the sexual, social, economic, political, and legal plane, have managed to make visible and denaturalize a reality imposed from the authoritarian and tax colonialism. These movements gained strength after the Second World War, establishing a break with the past. The colonized nations rose up to seek independence, and new changes in customs were established. From a psychological point of view, it was no longer necessary to retain, but to release, uncover, unhide, free oneself, from oppression and the impositions that limited freedom, and sexual, political, ideological, and aesthetic expression. In our continent these movements were suffocated by the advent of military dictatorships and imperialist intervention in complicity with the respective armies of our nations. The American Empire was threatened by opposition ideologies that could spread in the Western Hemisphere and that resisted its hegemonic interests. After the military dictatorships, the conservative political parties continued to be an impediment to the resurgence of these libertarian minorities, invisible. It was many years later, from the first progressive governments whose parties ideologically separated from the first, when these libertarian and invisible minorities were attended, listened to, and protected. These sudden changes aroused a deep malaise in the conservative and religious sectors, since any thought that provokes hegemonic criticism and civil disobedience, inspires insecurity in these sectors, and instills strong resistance to structural changes. This situation, at the same time, carries with it an intense fear of being abandoned by the imperialist powers. This bond of dependency promises a sense of protection, security, and significance. He admires himself, and unconditionally submits to any manifestation of power, to what God represents: power, empire, nation, force, nature. All of this inspires shelter and security in conservative political tendencies. On the other hand, all kinds of manifestations that express weakness, helplessness, lack, and scarcity are hated. The most conservative political parties, that is, those that are more under the unconscious influence of colonialist forces, will resist more to injustices caused by military, political, and religious power. This admiration for power in itself hides certain irrational and paradoxical fears of the aggressor himself. We have seen the admiration and submission to the aggressor, who is feared, envied, idealized, imitated, and obeyed, and from whom protection is expected, and his glory is shared. I do not consider it correct to call the political parties of the left or right, conservatives, or progressive, because these labels mark a position of immutability and fragmentation between one and the other. The forces that operate in political parties, and in culture in a general sense, are historical, unconscious, and operate with a certain intensity from a surreptitious perspective, a colonialist and Eurocentric logic. As these forces become more intense, the political parties will find themselves more intensely overshadowed by them. It is possible that a political party that boasts of being progressive backs down at some point from these colonial ideologies, and that a conservative political party moves away from them. The influence of these historical forces is constituted by ideologies, logics, affections, religious contents, ways of interpreting reality, of seeing the world, of feeling it. It is given by the Eurocentric and westernized culture, by the admiration and exaltation of power over weakness, by the racist concept of inferior and superior, of savage and civilized, by the logic of competition, and by judging what we see through the eyes of European culture. It is constituted by the concept of nature as an object that can be subjugated and conquered, and not as integration, as a harmonious whole. In the West there is a monotheocentric separation between nature and the human being, unlike animist and pantheistic religions, pagan for Christianity, for which the elements of nature are either geological, cosmic, or geographical. Botanists, and zoos, are endowed with consciousness and, therefore, a deleterious tendency towards the natural would be unthinkable for animistic peoples. If nature is supposed to contain consciousness, spiritual life, and intelligence, to attempt against it would imply violence to the divine beings that comprise it. The Western culture has been the one that has violated, contaminated, destroyed, plundered, killed, burned nature more than any other. It is said that in the 19th century, and during the Civil War, an Afro-descendant man, a servant of European settlers, who had been granted greater authority, had the order to watch over and punish the slaves of these settlers. When the servant became angry with the slaves, he treated them as cursed blacks, refusing to recognize himself as an Afro-descendant man, and identifying himself with the white aggressor, reproducing the oppressive violence of the colonists, losing reference to himself. At times, the servant, as enslaved as everyone else, felt significant when sharing the glory of his masters, perceiving himself as a white man, and free, when in reality, he continued to be as despised as everyone else. The other slaves. However, despite absolute obedience, the attacking colonists always have to treat him as an object, a thing of no value. The fear and impotence before the oppressive colonists led him to a feeling of resignation and evasion of freedom. Through this mechanism, he obtained some relief from his sufferings by becoming one more oppressor, someone and something that he is not. In the same way, we have received a colonial culture of submission that has been internalized from an unconscious perspective. Externally we have the conviction of being free, masters of our destiny, and of our own spontaneous thoughts. We glory in having the freedom to choose, when in reality we are one more cog in a huge machinery. Educated in irrational submission, the adherents of a conservative morality, rooted in their traditions and whose thoughts have become a passive receptacle before the orders and impositions that are imposed from the outside, and constantly resisting structural social changes, and transgress established traditions. As Lasky stated, it is precisely the savage who is afraid of transgressing traditions to the point of dying of terror. We owe the evolution of universal civilization to individuals who were skeptical of the truths considered indubitable. It is precisely to them that we owe advances in all human aspects, to our well-being, to the ability to question, to change, to see reality from different converging angles. They knew very well that culture establishes what is not allowed to question under any argument, we are required not to deviate from the path traced by custom and tradition because that is good for the citizen. Deviating from the norm is considered dangerous. Any manifestation of resistance to changes in social customs, to the modification of the status quo, to the questioning of daily life, is considered a problem. Lasky, 2011, p. 45. The economy has also been one of the multiple destinations of religious transmutation by which the sacred characteristics of the saints, reformers, and popes of the past have been distorted, changing the physiognomy of those who hold it, such as industrialists, businessmen, or businessmen. They preach a new gospel affirming that in the business world the one who fails is guilty, where, according to Lasky, poverty is related to moral defect. We are taught not to share a collective life, to safeguard our individual personality. The profit motive concentrates wealth in a few hands and, by confusing means with ends, creates rivalries, conflicts, for which victory is determined by the strongest. From China to Peru, the businessman has imposed his faith. It has convinced entire nations that economic effort is good in itself and that the more intense it is, the more society will gain, no matter what end it pursues or how it is pursued. Having made the sin of poverty, he has turned wealth into virtue and the effort to conquer it into a service due to the state. Thus the businessman has been able to argue that everything that hinders the path to wealth, that is, any limitation of the right to property, harms social welfare. Like Adam Smith, he accepts an unfathomable dictation of providence according to which the greater the purchasing power of a person, the more generous the services he renders to society. Just as the oyster hides the pearl that the bile of the sperm whale produces ambergris, the vanity of the businessman has as its mysterious secretion the progress of humanity. This was the gospel of Prime Minister Baldwin, it is the gospel of President Hoover and the United States Supreme Court, the 14th Amendment. The only flaw in that gospel is that it doesn't match reality. The businessman is the new priest of the capitalist religion, which according to Lasky embodies our time as Luther the Protestant Reformation. Lasky, 2011, pages 45 to 48. The Western civilization has undergone what I have to call a process of social lithification, of hardening of its human aspects, of its affective ties. To the extent that a civilization hierarchizes matter, that is, what is dead over what is alive, we say that it is in a process of lithification. It has lost life, its human bonds have materialized, and an exchange has taken place in the social structure, where life, emotions, affections are giving way to the inert, where the throbbing being gives way to having material, to the obsessive possession of things and objects. We often say that a person has a heart as hard as a stone, to indicate that what was beating, that was alive, felt, moved, today has become paralyzed, has become mineralized, hardened, has been lithified, has died, has become insensitive. We no longer feel the pain that our actions inflict on others, and our lithified affections have solidified enough to minimize the pain that others inflict on us. We do not love or allow others to love us. Societies can end up undergoing a process similar to what we will call social lithification. In this process towards lithification, constituted by excessive profit, obsessive consumption, dependence, selfishness, frenzy for waste, service as a means of enrichment and corruption, obsession with number and quantity, utilitarianism, and even contempt for life itself, constitute the concentration of those dead sediments that are exchanging life for dead things, crystallizing the affective sensitivity and love of life for matter. The subjects are transformed into a thing, into interchangeable objects without affective value, where the living aspects are being replaced, substituted, and impregnated. Historically we have advanced from technological, scientific aspects like never before, however our own discoveries do not necessarily make us more human. Moreover, it may happen that, filled with arrogance by these remarkable advances, we underestimate the vital importance of these same human bonds that must be founded on solidarity and love. We have focused our hopes on the matter, we have built a new religion based on the worship of an inanimate God who stands tall, enthroned on a gigantic technological altar. Instead of interpreting having, as a necessary means for our social well-being, we have turned it into an end in itself, a fetish, a dead idol, and now we worship it. The greater our material idol, the less value we offer to life itself. In this 21st century, it is necessary to build a paradigm shift from a lithified society to a humanized society. It is necessary to deconstruct a vast edifice of already rusty convictions and traditions to build new ideas based on the ecology of borders, the inclusion of what is different, network links, diversity, freedom from real and psychological colonialism, hope, contemplating with joy the gradual departure from mechanistic, linear, deterministic, and reductionist ideas. We must move towards the past, towards the ancestral and complementary thought, abandoning the antagonistic Western dualism that the Judeo-Christian culture has left us as an inheritance. Overcome the feeling of loneliness, isolation, doubt, helplessness, insecurity, a consequence of this fragmentary thinking, and build other concepts about progress. Certainly the original nations, oppressed by the colonialist nations, were the bearers of a vital worldview for the evolution of our Western civilization. From a European hegemonic perspective, colonialism pointed out as savage and inferior, or under a state of innocence to the original nations which conceived a sense of unity and natural complementarity. From a reductionist thinking that does not take into consideration the whole as a single indivisible reality, the Westerner has decomposed this reality into small parts without understanding the complex network of interactions that each one of them maintains with each other, and with the environment. This reductionist thinking does not allow him to understand that the modification, alteration, or even the damage that we inflict on one of them, damages and modifies the whole. Utilitarian thinking has dismissed this reality. The deleterious destabilization of nature, and ecology, is the result of this fragmentary thinking. For the Western worldview, a certain extension of territory is in a certain sense equal to another, the value of the land is proficient, and it does not have a sacred connotation as it does for the ancient inhabitants of these lands. By not taking into account the whole as a single reality, by feeling fragmented in the face of nature, which he stripped of its sacred and living character, he has polluted and predated it without considering and without caring about the consequences that his actions will have in other remote places, and in the following generations. The social lithification we were talking about, mathematical thinking, the concept of a nature perceived as inferior and separate, has not allowed us to understand that we are part of a totality within which we are intimately integrated. We have done with nature the same as we have done with human existence itself. We have tied it up, plundered, contaminated and murdered it. We interpret it as a disposable object, without realizing that this damage would sooner or later catch us. To the extent that we have mastered the forces of nature, we have become proud. We have conceived a linear historical process, through the fallacy of an endless, continuous, and eternal progress, from which the fact of looking to the past, towards our native ancestors, to learn from their integrating worldview has been considered as absurd, since the civilized man has nothing to learn from ignorant and idolatrous cultures. By conceiving life and death as antagonistic situations, for the Westerner death produces a greater fear. Death is not something that is lived every day, but something that is expected, and that one day it will come. Although death is painful in all cultures, by not being able to conceive of life and death as simultaneous and indivisible conditions, life and death have a totally different concept. In a spiral movement, and in the same way as the sun rises in east and sets in west, or the observation of the lunar phases, the native is born and dies every day. Being aware and living simultaneously with life and death, teaches us the transitory and fragile condition of our existence, prompts us to value this very moment, to contemplate ourselves as fleeting beings, to understand that the greatest effort we can make in this short time that we have, is to live in function of the other beings that surround us. The original philosopher conceives life and death as beginning and end at the same time. In the same way, the future is not yet to come, nor is the past gone, it is something that is happening at this very moment. He does not feel lonely. The idea that everything that exists has an animated life, helps him to understand himself as the same integrated and indivisible reality with nature and with his community. These philosophers do not interpret the culmination of something as the end, but as the beginning of something new. The process of life is not interpreted as the accumulation of years. The idea of accumulating, of possessing, is not in their plans. This worldview can be very useful to deconstruct Eurocentric and colonialist thought, and to build an inclusive existence. The movements for the rights of minorities, the emancipation of women, social opposition to racism, xenophobia, cultural, sexual, ethical, aesthetic, and ecological changes, involve hard work to deconstruct the heavy historical burden that we have inherited of colonialism. The original philosopher conceived the universe and the earth as a living totality, in such a way that nothing is separate from the whole, nothing is superior or inferior to the others, while life itself is worthy of respect. Nature has a life of its own, in such a way that it can suffer and rebel if it were preyed upon. Everything is sacred. The Pachamama, the Apis Humanis, the hills, the sun, the mountains, the stones, the water, the animals. The indigenous world is conceived in a spiral, it is not linear. Time is simultaneously the beginning and the end. Space is an interconnected web of natural and human cosmic relationships. The future is not something that is to come, nor is the past something that is gone. The time is coming. The end of the year is the beginning of a new life and not the sum of accumulated years. In the thought of the original nations, there is a linking relationship between the cosmos, the world, and nature. The apparent opposites are not antagonistic but complementary, in such a way that there is unity in natural and human diversity. We build reality together. We need to listen to each other, complement each other, know the eyes of others in order to grow in harmony and unity. We learn more through heterogeneous links than homogeneous ones. We all have the ability to teach and learn simultaneously, therefore no one is the owner of an absolute truth, since we need the other to build it. An ancient Hindu parable told us that 6 blind wise men wanted to know what an elephant was like by touching the different parts of the animal. The first one touched a leg, and said that the elephant is like a column. The second touched the tail, and claimed that it is similar to a rope. The third touched the trunk, and concluded that it was like a branch of a tree. The fourth touched an ear, and said it resembled a fan. The fifth touched the belly and claimed it was similar to a wall. The sixth touched the tusk, and assured that it was like a solid tube. In reality, we need the gaze of the other to build reality, and even then we will not be able to cover it in its entirety. We know a part of it, and yet we are totally convinced that we know it completely. We underestimate the other's gaze, thinking that ours is better, ignoring complementarity. We know what we touch, but we do not know what we do not touch, therefore we need the other to know. This reality demands humility, patience, communication, learning, listening to each other, valuing each other, understanding that we cannot know the whole, understanding reality as an indivisible, complex unit, learning to strip ourselves of omnipotence, dogmatism, and dependency bonds. The authoritarian ideologies that we have seen grow with some regularity in the West respond to that conception of an absolute truth imposed as a religious obligation, as Lasky affirmed. Willing to destroy their opponents, to establish a one-party state whose essence has been the identification of the party structure with the apparatus of state power. So all opposition to the party was translated into opposition to the state. Dissensions are those that threaten the established power, instead of strengthening it. This power sees the different as an obvious danger, as an opponent, who must be overthrown by all possible means. War, or the threat of it, is always a means of consolidating the psychological unity of the nation. Lasky, 1971. The dominant truth is fiercely opposed to the changes that may establish the freedom of heterogeneous thought, the diversity of discourses, to impose absolutist perpetuity. Change implies exposing oneself to certain dangerous questions, and oppositions that threaten the perpetuity of the truth. If there is something worthy of change, this should be done so that everything remains the same. Freedom can come to overwhelm the subject, who remains subject to the protection of political, religious, or other forces that give him a certain sense of security, a reason to live for, and be able to suffocate a feeling of insignificance, loneliness, and helplessness. It is vitally important to consider the integrative, complementary, holistic aspects, estimating the dialogue, the exchange of knowledge with the other social actors. We enrich ourselves by understanding that opposites are complementary and not contradictory. I believe I have demonstrated the bifragmentary influence, the absolutist and colonialist character that monotheism as a powerful historical force has transmuted its contents in various destinations. I want to underline some monotheocentric characteristics, some of them we have already mentioned. 1. Bifragmentation. Monotheism has bifragmented Western thought into the dichotomy yes or no, heaven and hell, light and darkness, blessed and condemned, truth not truth, Protestants and Catholics, Calvinism and Lutheranism, between a single divinely chosen people, and the other inferior and pagan peoples. Between Gentiles and Jews, predestined and not predestined, saints and infidels, truth and heresy, black and white, material and spiritual, soul and spirit, civilized and wild, superior races and inferior races, east and west, winners and losers, first world and third world, center and periphery nations, capitalism and communism, the singular and the collective. He who abandons the only truth, with which he has communed for a long time, must know that he no longer has a safe place to go. If you were able to abandon the only truth, then you no longer have new truths to turn to and feel protected, because in reality there are not multiple truths, various possibilities, and various paths. Therefore, there is no other alternative. Either you will continue to practice the one truth, or else by deviating from it, you will become reprobate, heretic, and despised in your community. All the events of daily life happen because of the divine will, whether they are tragic or happy events. A supernatural explanation must always be sought for each of these events. It is assumed then that God is continuously intervening in the life of humanity. Everything that happens is due because Providence has wanted it that way. This is a mystery that no one should question, otherwise he will incur the crime of sin due to his mistrust. If something beneficial or something tragic happens, we will find the answer in the will of God. It was given because the divinity wanted it to be so, and his will is indisputable. It is also possible that God has allowed it because of sin, enabling the devil to scourge the victim as a result of their sin or to test their faith. There must always be a supernatural explanation for all events in life. Faced with this difficult situation, the subject has no alternative but to continue belonging to the group of the chosen. Otherwise he is only left with the condemnation and silence of his community, since the only truth can only be obtained through fidelity to God and to his religious group and not to another. There is no other saving place outside of there. If you want to leave your small island, you will have to shipwreck in the middle of a gigantic ocean of uncertainty, because you will not be able to find another territory or continent where to put your feet. Belonging to the monotheistic faith implies always keeping in mind that it is not possible to get away from it and continue to remain at the same time in a state of salvation. 2. Anthropological colonialism. Non-European peoples have historically been considered inferior and pagan. It is assumed that there is no useful knowledge in them that the European can learn. What can we learn from the inferior cultures, whose practices are contrary to European Christian morality? The term savage was coined by anthropologists from colonizing nations such as James Fraser, Lewis H. Morgan and their Primitive Society, Bronislaw Malinowski. The valorization of the different implies breaking with colonialist, racist, monotheocentric logics, which have undermined Western thinking. Words construct a discourse, create a truth, a logic, appropriate the human being, control it, label it, separate it, and segregate it. 3. Absolutism, violence, and intolerance. The monotheistic God is authoritarian. He repents of the works of his hands and destroys them, opposing mortals pretending to be like him. His invisible and exalted power must necessarily be obeyed, otherwise damnation and punishment must be awaited. He is an angry God, driven by dominion and power, and not by love. Humanity is obliged to venerate it, to submit submissively, thus losing its own independence in exchange for protection. He is an omnipotent God. On the other hand, humanity appears powerless, as an insignificant object in the hands of a terrible deity who expels the first human couple because of the sin of disobedience. This same bond of dependence between God and humanity has historically transmuted into the totalitarian state, nationalism, politics, dictatorship, and totalitarian ideologies. Although the discourse of an authoritarian God has undergone theological changes throughout the biblical account, by other more tenuous discourses, either through the establishment of covenants, commandments, and later under religious mysticism within Judaism as well as Christianity, it is evident the difficulty that monotheism has to shed the ingrained idea of a single absolute truth and the urgency to combat the idolatrous heresy. To the extent that the monotheistic God is elevated and enthroned, he will be seen with greater perfection, and instead, humanity will be reduced to a greater imperfection. The subject becomes nothing, because all the best that he has been deposited in that God, seeing himself dispossessed. He has enriched God but he has impoverished himself, he no longer has anything of his own, everything belongs to divinity. For the one monotheistic God there is only one truth, and his followers are the only ones who hold it and those who have the divine commission to impose it on all other wrong beliefs. The deity is considered incomparably superior to humanity in contrast to the polytheistic idea by which the gods are barely superior to humans, are limited and possess our same limitations, which builds a more tolerant thought towards other beliefs. The profound historical changes are preceded by the criticism of the hegemonic religion. Religious tradition and the only truth have resisted scientific advances, avoiding the possibility of structural changes. In the Enlightenment period, this one truth was challenged with great intensity, allowing for major changes. However, the bifragmentary monotheocentric forces were prolonged through the transmutation of contents under scientific aspects, through the appearance of a-scientific racism, also in philosophy, anthropology, law, and under the belief of superior beings and inferior beings. In the Reformation period, the concept of single truth was not only held by Catholicism, it was also held by dissident Protestant sects, competing with each other to impose that truth. David Hume had already observed this in the 18th century. For Hume, idolatry expresses tolerance in itself as opposed to monotheistic violence and intolerance. The tolerant spirit of idolaters, both in ancient and modern times, is very evident, to anyone, even the least versed in the writings of historians and travelers. What did the Oracle of Delphi respond when asked what were the most acceptable rites or cults for the gods? Those that are legally established in each city. In those times, even the priests could admit, it seems, the salvation of those who belonged to different communions. The Romans commonly adopted the gods of the conquered peoples and never discussed the attributes of the local and national deities in whose territories they resided. Religious wars and the persecutions of idolatrous Egyptians are certainly an exception to this rule.